In the 1970s, Boston, Massachusetts schools were still segregated between blacks and whites. Even after the 1954 court case, Brown v. Board of Education, which desegregated schools in the South, the northern city of Boston was still judicially undisturbed to desegregate. At this time, Boston and Massachusetts were the pride of American liberalism, the political and literary pace-setter for the new nation. However, 85% of black students in Boston went to school with a black majority, and over half the black students in Boston went to schools with a 90% majority. In January of 1965, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare gave Boston until February 9, 1965, to formulate a plan to integrate the schools, or Boston would lose financial aid or eventually face court action.
Though Boston stood to lose $300 million in financial aid, a plan to desegregate was not made. "We cannot respond to the time they have given us," Chairman James Hennigan said. In the same year, President Nixon outright told the public he was against busing, removing any punishment on Boston's lack of a plan. Later in 1965, Massachusetts enacted the Racial Imbalance Act, which required school districts to desegregate any school that was more than 50% minority.
However, Boston did not react. In 1971, the Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education court case ruled for busing to desegregate schools. This court case ordered the desegregation of schools all over America, so the decision was made in Virginia. Schools remained generally the same as before. 3 years later, on June 21, 1974, Judge Garrity ordered Boston to desegregate all public schools by forced busing. This new plan required students from white neighborhoods to go to school in black neighborhoods and students from black areas to go to the schools in the white areas of Boston to balance the racial diversity. Phase 1 of Garrity's plan would commence in the fall of 1974 and require the busing of some 17,000 pupils. Phase 2 was to begin the following fall, with a mandatory busing affecting approximately 21,000 students. This decision caused a large debate between anti-bussers and pro-bussers, which later caused violence and outrage. Roxbury, a mainly black town, and South Boston, a predominantly white town, were the major areas affected. The forced busing of white and black students between Roxbury and South Boston caused debate and conflict between racial groups and ultimately resulted in riots and violence.
Although the majority of people in Boston were against busing, there were several people who were for it. Mainly, the reason for the busing of black students into Boston and the busing of white students into Roxbury was to abide by the law that declared that schools should not be less than 50% minority, the Racial Imbalance Act. People wanted the desegregation to have black students and white students go to school together, so neither group of children felt more superior than the other. Of the 55 racially imbalanced schools in Massachusetts, 45 of them were in Boston. The government feared that segregated schools encouraged prejudice between children. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, tried to increase the public awareness of this segregation by holding open hearings and nonviolent school boycotts.
I feel that at this time, any school that is predominantly Negro is an inadequate school.
They also filed a lawsuit against the Boston School Committee to stop its practice of segregated schools. This lawsuit was one of the significant factors that led to Judge Garrity's court order.
Another reason for supporting busing was that the citizens of Boston wanted to improve the education of students. Sociologist David J. Armour explains that black students would have more doors open for them going to a middle-class white school than if they attended a predominantly black school. The quality of education in the Boston white schools was greater than the quality of the mostly black schools.
Crowded classrooms, temporary teachers, not enough books, and supplies were low and all of that kind of thing.
Whispering words of wisdom.
However, the majority of people in Boston were against the forced busing Judge Garrity promoted. Well before Judge Garrity's decision, the leaders of the opposition to the Racial Imbalance Act had been planning for the worst. Mid-March, this coalition declared its existence as a Save Boston Committee, but soon renamed this umbrella group of anti-busing networks ROAR, or Restore Our Alienated Rights. On the night of Garrity's decision, ROAR planned a 2-week boycott of public schools. Within the next 3 years, similar plans were created and supported by ROAR. This organization's main argument was the downgrade in public schools. They believed public schools in South Boston, as well as Roxbury, would become a place where no learning was done. Busing, they hold, too easily becomes a case of form over substance, in which the form of racial integration of education becomes of greater value than the substance of what is actually taught in schools, opposers of busing refute.
Many anti-bussers supported the fact that busing was too costly for Boston to promote. The Supreme Court judge, who did not support busing, estimated that busing 13,300 children on 138 buses would bring annual operating expenses up to $532,000, and the startup costs would be $1,011,200. This money to collect was difficult due to reluctant people, non-supporters, and the lower class with salaries not large enough to support the cost. School integration costed the Boston School District an estimated $20 million more in busing costs than neighborhood schools would cost. This high price forced several people to be against busing. Even the state legislature did not approve. On June 29th, the request of Governor Sargent for desegregation funds was not filled until a month later, and when Mayor White asked the City Council for an extra $4.2 million for desegregation on July 12th, it took 2 court orders to secure the funds in early August. Critics of busing also claimed that busing caused white flight. White flight is when white families leave the city and move to larger suburban areas with more white families. Citizens claimed that busing caused white people to leave Boston, which caused even more segregation. This white flight is costly for the economy, with so many families moving away from the public schools, also costing the public schools a lot of tax money that could be used to better the system.
Lastly, anti-bussers anticipated violence to come along with the Boston busing Judge Garrity promoted. On the eve of the Garrity decision's first phase, anticipated boycotts from the whites made the city tense. Whites were said to be intensely hostile to blacks.
I'm talking about white folk. By the time busing came around, these people were ripe for revolution.
When we go up there, we're going to be stoned. It's not fair to me, because why is the other way around when they come up here? When they come up here, we won't mess with them, so why when we come up there, they mess with us? And I don't think it's fair. It's not fair to me.
No one doubted that trouble would greet the buses. The only question was how much. John Kerrigan spoke out to a Bostonian crowd days before the decision was fully put into place. Join me in the school committee in the nonviolent activity. I hope you will be so nonviolent that we will win the Nobel Peace Prize. They anticipated violence would soon shake the city of Boston. The first days, weeks, and months constituted a difficult experience for thousands of parents and children, resulting in many missed or disrupted school days for thousands of pupils. As expected, violence struck Boston on September 12, 1974, the opening day for public schools. A white boycott cut the attendance to less than 100 of the expected 1,500 students. Buses carrying black students were stoned leaving the school, their windows broken, children cut by shattered glass.
Throwing eggs at the window and try to hit people with them.
An anti-busing march on October 4th consisted of 5,000 anti-bussers through the streets of South Boston. Children were afraid to go to school. What we prayed wouldn't happen has happened, the Boston Globe wrote on October 9, 1974. The city of Boston has gotten out of control. The forced busing in Boston eventually caused several people to leave the city and move out to the suburbs. The violence and dispute of the city were too much to handle.
People. As a community, it's tearing them apart. They may say this is helping, it's tearing them apart. I'm not for this, I don't care, my one will not go to school, but it's tearing them apart.
The decision Judge Garrity made for Boston led to these violent effects.
I think that time will bring about an understanding on the part of most people that there's no alternative.
Now, 37 years later, public schools have achieved integration. However, forced busing in Boston in the 1970s is still remembered today.